You sometimes find yourself getting angry or upset when things start to change with your loved one. Have you considered that this anger is actually the way you are choosing to deal with an underlying fear? Welcome to the Surviving Alzheimer's podcast. I'm your host, Ken Cardita. In this podcast, I share with you my experiences and learnings from the last 13 years as I've walked by the side of my dear wife, Shanna, as she progresses through Alzheimer's disease. It is my desire that you'll find joy and peace while learning to live with your loved one's disease, and not let the disease define you or your loved one. The Surviving Alzheimer's podcast is brought to you by Ascending Minds, LLC. Welcome to episode 23 of the Surviving Alzheimer's podcast. Today, we'll take another look at fear and how it can hold us hostage. This is part 2 of the series. In our last episode, we talked about a couple of different types of fear, and in this episode, we'll take a look at the remaining 2 types of fear that we can encounter as caregivers. I'll also share some experiences and how I dealt with these types of fears and what I learned along the way. I would invite you to see if you are having these types of fears or experiences with your loved one currently, and you may be able to find something to help you better understand what you're dealing with and how you may be able to conquer these fears. Today's listener's comment comes from Ken Levitt. Congratulations on a job well done. Listening to your podcasts are so rewarding. Thanks so much for sharing. Thanks, Ken. Ken is a member of a support group that I've attended for about 2 years called Men Who Care. And that support group was the initial inspiration for creating this podcast. I have learned many things from Ken and the other people in that group. In fact, a few members of the group are listeners to the podcast. I plan on talking more about this particular support group and how it has helped me in a future podcast episode. So in our last episode, we went over the 4 types of fear you may encounter. The ones we covered last episode, in episode 22, were the freezing and the faint fear. And these are both types of fear that are passive, that we don't really have a lot of body movement. They're more in our mind. Freezing fear is a simple and powerful avoidance strategy that freezes us dead in our tracks, like the deer in the headlights. Faint fear is more extreme and typically isn't seen with most people. It's often only reported with people who suffer from PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. As caregivers, we may just feel very overwhelmed and become burnt out. That's probably as close as we'll come to that. But again, we dealt with this in the last episode. In today's episode, we'll talk about fight fear, which is an active defensive behavior, resulting in some kind of actions or movements. And on the surface, this fight fear can look like anger. Most people can't really tell the difference between this fight fear and anger. How do you know if you're experiencing that? Signs of fight fear include things like increased heart rate, release of adrenaline, tensing of muscles. One way to differentiate between the two, anger and fight fear, is that notice where you're feeling this. When you're angry, you'll often have a clenched jaw, a tight neck, or a tight back. When you're having more this fight fear, you're feeling it more in your gut. You're feeling discomfort in your stomach or gut feeling. Now let's look at some examples as a caregiver where you might experience this fight fear. When we get frustrated with our loved ones' new behaviors, like when they start repeating questions or start having delusions or hallucinations. When they start experiencing this, our reaction, which is truly based out of fear, might first show up as being angry. We might get upset with our loved one and will take an action of arguing with them that no, your delusions are wrong, or no, there's no hallucination. What you're seeing is not real. We'll have this less than compassionate response, which could be described as anger, but it's really coming out of fear. Now, in my personal experience with this, as well as when I have coached other people, we can ask some questions. We can understand what we're thinking that's driving our emotions, and this often will uncover what we're afraid of. Oftentimes, we feel like we're out of control of the situation. Now, the next type of fear is a flee fear. This is when, again, it's also a very active defensive behavior. And it is when we feel like we're in a life-threatening situation and all we can do is run. And the purpose of this type of flee or flight fear is to create some physical space between what we're afraid of and increase our chances of escaping. The classic version of this is in the animal kingdom when a predator like a lion is chasing its prey. The prey takes off and runs. Now, how does this manifest itself as a caregiver? Maybe we're so afraid of dealing with the situation that we can't handle it anymore, and we literally run away from it. This may be when a caregiver or a person of responsibility walks away from being a caregiver and is unable to accept that responsibility. Please note, I am not talking about someone who chooses to move their loved one to an assisted living or a memory care facility when it is no longer safe for them at home, or they are no longer able to care for them by themselves. This is not what I'm talking about. Let's take a look at some of the common things that might show up as a caregiver that fall into the fight type of fear. One that I've experienced is not being able to calm down our loved one. When our loved one may get excited or upset about something and we try our best to calm them down, we respond by getting angry at them. And really what's happening is we are afraid that we can't calm them down. Early in our journey, Shanna resisted in taking her medications at times. And I harbored this intense fear that if she didn't take her medications, she would be out of control and I would not be able to care for her. Here was what I wrote in my journal. I think she woke up in a bad mood. It has been mildly brewing for the last 2 days and finally reared its ugly head today. Almost anything could be the reason why she's so upset. She has not been her normal happy self lately. The following things have changed. The weather has turned very hot, and as a result, she has not been able to go on a walk for about 3 days. She has been more bored in this last week. The heat limits her energy and what we can do. It's been frustrating for her to try and get her scheduled mammogram. We have gone twice and have had to go home empty-handed for a variety of reasons. She has anxiety over this, and also the fact that our son recently received a thyroid cancer diagnosis. This scares me, and if it persists and dominates, I fear that I will not be able to take care of her. I must remain calm and go by the Spirit to navigate this rough sea. Now, this was a time of a lot of turmoil in our lives. We were both very concerned about our oldest son who received that thyroid cancer diagnosis. In the weeks and months that followed, he received proper treatment and was cured of it and has not had to deal with it in the years since. But at the time, we did not know this. So as Shanna was getting upset and irritable, she wouldn't take her medications, and she would fight me on it. And I had this huge fear that, combined with this change of her behavior and not taking her medications, it would only get worse. How did I deal with this? I stopped fighting with her about taking her medications. There were some times that she would take them much later in the day. There were even a few days where she didn't take them. And in reality, nothing dramatic happened. I just learned to read her moods, and if she wasn't in a particularly good mood, I would not ask her to take her medications, yet I would wait till later on where she may be in a more cooperative state. In fact, this is exactly how the Memory Care Center has dealt with this. As Shanna transitioned into memory care and at first struggled to take her meds by the med techs, they have learned by their experience not to stress about it and to get it done when she's ready. The next fear I'd like to talk about is a fear about our loved one forgetting who we are. I have always really struggled with this. And there were a few times when Shanna was living with me where this happened. Here's a journal entry that captures one of the very first times that this happened. It seems that Shanna does not recognize me as her husband. She called me Ken, but I was not her husband. And this explains a lot of this week's changes that I've observed. Her constant desire to be alone, her shyness when I was trying to help her put on her swimsuit, the anger that she expressed towards me, and resisting my comforting touch every time I tried to touch her, she would pull back, reluctance to give me a hug and a kiss when I thought she was still feeling okay. It seems that she's lost her sense of trust with me. This is a phase that I have been fearing for a couple of years. The grief and loss go very deep. This happened again. A month or so later is an example of how I dealt with this in a much more positive way. And now for the strange part. At about 4 p.m., Shanna was reacting to me in a very strange and different way. It stayed that way until just about it was time for her to go to bed at about 7 p.m. At first, I thought she was upset about something I said or something I did, but I did not know what it was. I asked her a few times, but I did not pressure her. At one point, I just tried to talk to her, and I was able to get out of her that I may have done something. I tried a few guesses, but I did not figure it out, and I just chose to back off. This bugs me, as it always has me feeling that we're at that point where she forgets who I am. Instead of freaking out, I just went off and did a small meditation. I watched some videos on meditation, and in the last 24 hours, I've used it to calm my mind and deal with my fear and anxiety. As a result of meditating before going to bed, I had a good night's sleep. Now, I think I handle things better today and stayed out of the depression zone. So the couple of times that Shanna did not know who I was, it took me quite a while to figure it out. And when it happened, I did not overreact. I was sad, but I kept that to myself. And in time, usually the next day, it never happened, and she remembered who I was. But I lived in that constant fear. And luckily, years later, that has not happened. In fact, since she's been in memory care, she has had a very strong connection to who I am. I count that as a tender mercy, for as that is something I've prayed for just about every day, that we might retain that strong connection that we have. Another fear that I've experienced many times is the fear of what the next major decline might be. I've dealt with that in a variety of ways over the years, and I get a little bit better at it each time. Back in 2019, here's what I recorded in my journal when we were dealing with another chapter or a new chapter of her decline. This was recorded on September 11, 2019. Here's what I wrote. Okay, we've entered a new phase. For the last 4 days, Shanna has spent more time sleeping, being deep in her own thoughts, quiet when we're in the car, and at mealtime. She will sit on the couch doing nothing, just staring out the window for hours at a time. She less and less will start a conversation, and she seems very withdrawn. I have at times overreacted, asking her questions repeatedly. Is something wrong? Are you upset? And I was a bit freaked out by all of this. Fear of losing my connection with her. Now, again, like I said, as I was first experiencing this was Shanna withdrawing from the world into her own world. She was making a big change from being very interactive with me to going very inside of herself, and I thought I was losing her. Now, after 3 years of going through these declines, I realized that getting freaked out and being afraid of these things really didn't help. Actually, for me, it made it worse. So as I've reached a new chapter, I've learned that there's a process that I go through. At first, I experience this fear. I'm in great denial. And I tell myself, maybe something's happening. And I push it aside. When it starts to manifest itself in her behaviors more frequently, I come to the realization that yes, we're here. We're at a new phase. Most recently, in the last month or so, I've been going through a version of this fear. And it has to do with Shanna's physical decline, her decreased stamina, and her first couple of falls since she's moved to the memory care facility. What am I doing now to better deal with these things? That's going to be the subject of the next episode. And we'll discuss how over the last month or so I've wrestled with this fear and have come to terms with it. What can you do to combat fear? Well, that could take an entire episode. In fact, that will be our focus of our next episode as I use my recent example to go over that. But not to leave you hanging, here's an example from some of the very first few months after I moved Shanna into a memory care facility. My biggest fear at that time was that she would want to come home, and it would make her transition into memory care very difficult. This is a very common experience. I've seen a lot of people at memory care centers when they first move in, for that first couple of weeks, maybe even couple of months, they go through that. Luckily, Shanna never did, but I lived in fear of that for months and months. In fact, I would avoid anything that could potentially trigger her to feel homesick. I did not even utter the word home for almost a year when I was in her presence. And I would be on pins and needles if we were talking with someone, they started asking about our home or where we lived. This finally came to a head, and I learned an interesting lesson when it came to Shanna's dog, Dixie. Let me tell you a little bit about Dixie. Dixie is a dog that Shanna more or less rescued and had become very attached to over the last few years at home. Last 5 or 6 years, actually. Dixie was Shanna's unofficial therapy dog. Dixie has always been Shanna's constant companion and very much a calming influence to her. In fact, when Shanna would sit on the couch staring out the window, Dixie would be on the other side of the couch, looking out that window with her. Dixie followed Shanna around wherever she went and would often be found on her lap. They were inseparable. When it came time to move Shanna, I was actually concerned about how Dixie would react. After moving Shanna out, Dixie became very depressed for a few weeks. She kept wandering around the house looking for Shanna. In fact, every time I pulled into the garage, she'd come out and circle the car looking for Shanna. And this really tugged at my heartstrings. I wanted to bring Dixie to Shanna, but I was afraid if I did, Shanna would get homesick and want Dixie to stay with her, and it would cause all kinds of problems. So that was my dilemma. I was trying not to remind Shanna of home, but yet every day I was being reminded by Dixie that she was homesick. And I was imagining that Shanna was feeling the same way about Dixie. So I didn't even mention Dixie to her for months. And I went back and forth on this for about 6 months. Should I talk about the dog or not? Should I bring the dog to see Shanna? And I tortured myself for months about this. My sense of guilt of separating them led to feelings of wanting to reunite. So after about 6 months of this, I couldn't stand it any longer. And I decided to try and put this fear in its place by taking action. I decided to pray and ask if I should bring Dixie to see Shanna. And I received a very interesting answer to this prayer. The answer was, why don't you take her and see what happens? So I decided to do that on a Sunday afternoon. I was nervous. There was quite a bit of anxiousness on my part as I brought Dixie to the facility. And on the car ride, I received this interesting prompting of inspiration, and that was to have the camera on my phone ready to film when they were reunited. So that's what I did. And I was glad I followed that prompting. When I brought Dixie into the memory care center, she got so excited. I think she picked up Shanna's scent from walking around. And when Shanna saw Dixie, it was pure joy. And I was able to film this minute or two of their reuniting. And it was a great thing. Remember Dixie, Shannon? I brought Dixie to. Let's take her outside. Come on. Yeah, you see Mom? I told you we're gonna go see Mommy. She's excited to see you, sweetie. Oh, come on. Yeah, I told you we're gonna go see Mommy. Now she just wants to sit up in your lap. Here. There we go. She has missed you. And it is a video that I will watch for a long time. It shows Shanna's pure joy with the dog. And the dog with her. It was awesome. I've watched that video many times since. And I've brought Dixie to see Shanna a few times in the memory care center. And each time, Shanna is delighted. And I can talk about Dixie all the time with her now. When I bring Dixie these days, she is less interested, but still enjoys seeing her. So by taking action, I learned a big lesson. I took a risk. Joy was the result. And yes, things could have backfired. and I would have still learned a lesson either way. But when we replace our fear with faith and a desire to feel joy, great things may happen. Things may not turn out the way you expect, but for sure, there will be valuable lessons learned along the way. Rather than letting your fear keep you paralyzed, choose to act and see what happens. You never know. A memory of a lifetime could be awaiting. I'd like to invite you to see if you're experiencing a current fear. And I would like to invite you to face that fear by choosing to act on it and see what you might learn about it and what might happen. Sometimes you'll learn that the fear is not real and is only something that your brain has created to protect you from potentially experiencing some pain. Like I said, on our next episode, we'll take a look at a very recent experience I had in facing a big fear that I more or less have just finished dealing with, and how I was able to come to terms with that fear. I hope you get something out of these episodes and would love to hear your comments. Thanks for watching an episode of the Surviving Alzheimer's podcast. If you're new to this podcast, I recommend that you watch the first 13 episodes in order. That way you can learn about our backstory. This will make understanding later episodes much easier. To help you with this, I've created a playlist. It's called Surviving Alzheimer's Podcast in Order. That way you can listen to all the episodes in the order that they were created. The mission of the Surviving Alzheimer's Podcast is to educate and inspire caregivers, family, and friends who are on their own unique journey down dementia road with their loved one. I would really appreciate it if you could share this episode to anyone who you feel would benefit from it. Additional ways for you to help us reach others are to hit the like button for this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell to be notified of new episodes. All of these actions will encourage the YouTube algorithm to share this episode and podcast to other potential viewers.